Welcome to the Human Experience Podcast, the only podcast designed to fuse your left and right brain hemispheres and feed it the most entertaining and mentally engaging topics on the planet. As we approach our ascent, please make sure your frontal, temporal and occipital lobes are in their full upright position. As you take your seat of consciousness, relax your senses and allow us to take you on a journey. We are the Intimate Strangers. Thank you for listening.
Friends, thank you so much for being here. We had a couple stream issues. After a short break of not doing any podcasts, we are finally back and live streaming. We've changed the format. And yes, it's just me behind the wheel. So if you feel some bumps, that's why. It's just our first show back. But sit back, relax, grab a drink, enjoy this conversation with my guest. My guest this week is Massimo Pigliucci. He is a scientist, skeptic, and philosopher who, in recent years, has written a number of books on Stoicism. He earned a Ph.D. in philosophy from the University of Tennessee and is the K.D. Irani Professor of Philosophy at the City of College of New York. He also has a background in biology with a Ph.D. in Evolutionary Biology from the University of Connecticut. Massimo, what a list of credentials you have, my good sir. Welcome to HXP.
It's a pleasure to be here. Let's hope that we're going to stay.
Yes, indeed. And we were talking a little bit about the show, and I mean, we were running into some issues. It's a perfect way to bring in what Stoic philosophy is and what Stoicism encompasses. Can you tell us a little bit about what is Stoicism?
Well, the two of us just experienced a classic situation where I think Stoicism helps. One of the fundamental concepts of Stoicism is something called the dichotomy of control, which essentially tells you or reminds you of the fact that some things are under your control and other things are not under your control. And that you, as a consequence, it's logical to focus on the things that are under your control and then take the rest as it comes. If you can influence it for the better, good. And if not, that's okay. You have to make peace of it with it. So, for instance, we just had, as you know, some technical difficulties. First with my setup, then with yours. Well, there are things we can do about it, of course. Right? So I tried to fix the bit on my part. Eventually, we succeeded. You tried to fix the bit on your part, and eventually, you did succeed. But while you were working on your part, there was absolutely nothing I could do other than just wait. Now, some people might get upset or nervous or, start fiddling around or something. In my case, it's like, well, if it's going to happen, it's going to happen. If it's not going to happen, it's going to happen another day.
For sure.
It's not a tragedy, right? It's not the end of the world. If we can make this happen today, great. If not, we will find something else. So this is a classic example of, many, many times in life, almost on a daily basis, we run across things that, small or big, that are going to frustrate us or that make us angry or that make us, disappointed and things like that. But if you train yourself to always, everything you do, think in terms of the dichotomy of control, you always ask yourself, the first question you ask yourself is, well, is this under my control? If the answer is yes, then, okay, well, what can I do about it? Mm-hmm. And if the answer is no, it's like, well, then sit back and relax because there's nothing else you can do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I mean, and this is why I think I connect with what Stoicism teaches so much, is because most of the things external to us are completely out of our control. Like we're not able to manage the emotions and feelings of other people. We can't imagine. I mean, and life tends to throw curveballs at us, and we sort of just have to adapt to those things. And I think this is where the strongest part of Stoicism is it kind of teaches you how to do that.
That's right. And the thing that's important, however, to keep in mind is this isn't a question of, it's not a quietist philosophy. It's not there's nothing I can do about it, therefore I'm just not going to do anything. If it were just that, then it would be a kind of losing proposition, because that means that you would just disengage from everything that you're not guaranteed to succeed. The approach is different. The approach is to try to keep in mind where your locus of action is. Where is it that you're going to be more effective in tackling a particular problem, and focus your energy there. the other side of that approach of the dichotomy of control is that what you cannot control, you should develop an attitude of equanimity, of sort of accepting with serenity what's going to happen. This is actually very similar to concepts that are found in other traditions, including in 8th century Buddhism and in medieval Judaism, and also in Christianity. Some of your listeners may have heard of the Serenity Prayer, which is a standard prayer. It's a 20th century Christian prayer that is used at the beginning of AA meetings or similar 12-step organizations. And of course, I never remember on the spot how exactly the prayer goes, but essentially it is asking God to allow you to make the distinction between what is under your control and what is not under your control, having the patience and fortitude to withstand, to accept what is not under your control, and the courage to actually change what it is under your control. Mm-hmm. It's essentially the same concept as in Stoicism, and it's not by chance, because as it turns out, the most famous rendition of this dichotomy of control is found at the beginning of Epictetus' Enchiridion. The Enchiridion is kind of a short manual for how to live your life, which was written in the 2nd century. And after the end of the Roman Empire, when Christianity basically took over throughout the Middle Ages, the Enchiridion was actually used by Christian monks as a training manual. The only difference with the original is that every time that Epictetus was talking about Socrates as an example, the good Christian monks replaced the word Socrates with the word Jesus. But other than that, it's the same thing. So it's no surprise that we actually find the same concept in a number of different traditions, including the Christian one, which has been highly influenced by Stoicism.
Mm-hmm. When I think of someone who is Stoic in mainstream culture, I think of Spock from Star Trek. That's who I think of when I think of someone who is Stoic. Is it, I mean, just to clarify this, is it suppressing your emotions? That's not what Stoicism is it?
No, it isn't. And in fact, I'm glad you brought up Spock, because the typical reaction of most practicing Stoics is to tell you that no, it isn't like Spock at all. But it's actually not quite that easy, because despite the fact that Spock is supposed to be suppressing emotions, if you actually pay attention to the original series and to the various movies based on the original series, you will see that Spock does have emotions. There are positive emotions, however. He loves his friends, for instance. Okay, love is an emotion. He says several times that he's a close friend of Captain Kirk and Dr. McCoy. He clearly cares about knowledge and science. He also very clearly cares about justice and ethics, right? And in one of the movies, he actually sacrifices himself, saying that the benefit of the many ought to outweigh the benefits of the one. Well, all of those are actually positive emotions. So despite Spock's own protestations that he doesn't have emotions and then he wants to control emotions, that's not quite what he's doing. What he's doing is to controlling the negative emotions, the disruptive emotions, things like anger, hatred, fear. Those are the emotions that are really not good for you. And that pretty much is the Stoic attitude. Stoicism is not about suppressing emotions, but rather, in a sense, to sort of reorient our emotional spectrum away from negative, disruptive emotions such as hatred, fear, and anger, especially, and toward the express cultivation of positive emotions such as love, joy, sense of justice, and so on and so forth. So in a sense, there is something true about the stereotype, except that, of course, like every stereotype, it only gets things half right or a quarter right, not the full picture. The other part of the stereotype that is typical when people use the word Stoic in the sort of the common meaning as opposed to the philosophical one is that Stoics are often envisioned as going through life with a stiff upper lip. Well, and so therefore being not particularly fun to hang around with. Mm-hmm. That's also not true, of course. But, Stoics do all sorts of things that everybody else does. In fact, Seneca, one of the major Roman Stoics, explicitly says that sometimes you just have to let it go dancing, go out for a walk, enjoying wine even to intoxication. That doesn't sound like somebody who's not having fun. Right. But the correct part of the stereotype is that, in fact, endurance is, in fact, a Stoic value.
Okay.
The notion is that we should endure what we cannot control. We're going back now to the dichotomy of control that we started with. Sure, if something is not under your control, if you cannot do anything about it, then you only have two choices, really. Either you endure it and try to sort of get over this particular hump in your life, or you can start throwing tantrums and get upset and
just makes it worse.
Which simply makes it worse.
Yeah.
That's right. It doesn't actually improve things. In fact, it makes it worse, makes you feel worse, and probably because that kind of strong emotional reaction clouds your judgment, it actually makes things also worse in a practical sense.
Yeah, I mean, if I think of any time where I've been in a situation where things are out of my control, whenever I make the choice to sort of react or bite into those emotions, it just makes it tremendously worse. I mean, whether it's, a fight with a friend or something that's going on, like I was traveling last week and it was like mini disaster after mini, like just putting out these various fires. And if you find yourself in this state of panic when that's happening, it merely makes the situation that much worse. So there's so much to be said about the power of Stoicism and having that, as you said, this sort of meter on your emotions and being aware of them and honing out, the negative versus the positive and being selective about that.
Yeah, part of the problem, of course, is, well, how do you do that? Because, the theory it's pretty clear. I mean, I can explain Stoic theory, the basics of Stoic theory in a few minutes. And if you really want to get into the details, we need a few hours, but no more than that. So it's not that difficult. It's the practice, of course, that is difficult. But let me tell you a couple of things about this. So first of all, it's not surprising that the practice is difficult. I mean, imagine a completely different kind of situations, which, however, the Stoics did use as an analogy often to explain their philosophy. They said, imagine you go to the gym. And you call up somebody, a trainer, and the trainer explains to you the theory of how to do your exercises. It's not rocket science. You can listen to the trainer and understand what he's saying, and in a few minutes you get the gist of it. But that doesn't mean that in a few minutes you're going to grow muscles and eliminate fat, right? So that's going to take hours and hours and days, and then months and months, and eventually years and years of practice. It's the same with a philosophy of life. Whether it's Stoicism or Christianity or Buddhism or anything else. The theory is not that difficult. The practice it takes time. You get better only with time. Now, there are, however, some basic techniques, some basic ways of doing this, and one of them is being proposed by a modern Stoic, actually, Bill Irvine, who is about to publish actually a new book called The Stoic Challenge, which is going to come out in September. And Bill says, okay, so every time you go through a situation like the one you were talking about at the airport, or you're on a vacation, things don't go well and everything. Well, try this little mental trick. Imagine that you think, okay, so this is the Stoics' God are sending me a test. They're testing me. They want to know how I'm doing under these conditions. And so for the duration of the test, which is, of course, the duration of whatever problem you have to actually tackle, you're going to keep mental scores with yourself about, so how am I doing? Am I reacting with anger? Am I actually reacting reasonably? Am I making progress? Am I getting frustrated? And so on and so forth. And then at the end, when the challenge is over, you sort of sit down, maybe even write it down and say, so how did I do on this? And the trick is, of course, it's a mind trick, right? But mind tricks are crucial. I mean, this is how we actually live our lives. I mean, our lives, our mental lives, and our actual real lives are the result of a number of mind tricks. The way you think about things completely changes the way you actually experience them and the way you react to them. So every time you have a challenge, every time that something happens that doesn't go your way, just say, stop for a second and say to yourself, either loudly if nobody's around to listen to you, or mentally, it's like, here comes a challenge from the Stoic gods. And you don't have to believe in Stoic gods, obviously. Bill Irvine doesn't believe in Stoic gods, and neither do I. It's just a mental device and say, okay, here's a challenge. Let me see how I do. Let me keep tabs on how I'm doing. And then I'm going to write a report to myself. That's an important part. So writing down things, essentially doing what Stoics refer to as a philosophical diary. It's important because, for one thing, it allows you after the fact to analyze more calmly your own reactions and think about what went right and what went wrong. But also, since you know you're going to do that, you're going to actually self-examine basically in writing, then Seneca suggests you're going to be more careful about what you do. Because you're not going to lie to yourself. If you know that you're going to have to write things down, you're not going to pretend that you did something different. You know what you did, and you're going to write it down. So you're going to hold yourself accountable, essentially, for your actions, both in the good and in the bad.
Okay, so I mean, there's a lot to unpack there, and I'm doing my best. So, I mean, first of all, you consider yourself a skeptic. I mean, you listed yourself as a skeptic. Does that mean that you have? I mean, do this more objectively. I would say, did the Stoics have a belief in God?
Well, in a sense, yes, but it needs to be really seriously qualified. So the Stoics were, from a modern perspective, what we would call pantheists. Mm-hmm. That is, they believed that God is immanent in the universe. In fact, they believed that God is the universe. God, for the Stoics, is made of matter. It's physical, and it is exactly the same thing as the universe. I mean, they're pretty explicit about this. If you check Diogenes Laertius, for instance, which is one of the commentators on the early Stoics, he says explicitly the Stoics called God the same as Zeus, the same as nature. It's the same thing. So, in a sense, yes, they did believe in God, but it's a God that it's actually essentially embedded in the laws of the universe. Now, one difference in the way in which we moderns might think of the universe and the way the Stoics thought is that the Stoics, just like pretty much everybody in antiquity, thought that the universe was a living organism. Mm-hmm. And therefore, the universe was doing whatever it is that it's good for itself. Okay? So everything that happens in the universe is good for the universe. And we are bits and pieces of that universe. So indirectly, in a sense, kind of good for us. But not in the sense that the universe actually cares about us, not that there is a God out there that decides, what's going to happen and what's not going to happen. It's just that the organism, that the cosmic organism is doing things, we are bits and pieces of that cosmic organism, and so we just go along for the ride. If you will, I've come up with an analogy to sort of explain what a little bit better, maybe what the concept is. So sure. I have, like every human being, we have, millions, hundreds of millions, actually billions of neurons in our brains, right? Each one of those cells is part of me. And I am the organism, so I do whatever it is that's good for me. So in this case, I'm talking to you, and then later on, I have dinner. Then I'm going to go for a walk or something like that. Well, my neurons don't know what's going on. Mm-hmm. But whatever I do is, in a sense, good for the neurons, meaning that the neurons are part of me. So they go along with the ride, they do their part. If I did not have neurons, I couldn't be talking to you. Mm-hmm. I couldn't be making decisions. I couldn't do anything. Okay. So the relationship between my neurons and myself is pretty much the relationship that the ancient Stoics thought there is between us and the universe, where we are the neurons. We're the cells. So the individual cells can die. The individual cells can, bad things can happen to individual cells. They can become, they can die out. They can become cancers or whatever it is. But what happens to the individual cells is part of the way in which the organism as a whole reacts. So that's the way the ancient Stoics thought about it. Now, most modern Stoics don't believe that the universe is a living organism, because modern physics tells us that things don't work that way. And so a modern Stoic is more likely to accept what is called Einstein's God sometimes. So Einstein was famously asked, do you believe in God? And his reply was, sure, I believe in the laws of nature. Mm-hmm. So God here is conceived as the fact that the universe has a rational structure. If it did not have a rational structure, we couldn't understand it. There would be no science possible. Just as for the ancient Stoics, God is the universe and we are bits and pieces of it, and we do our part within that universe. So in the same way, let's say my individual neurons don't know that I'm a part, that they are part of a living organism. And I am the living organism. I go around doing what it is that I need to do. And the neurons just both go along for the ride and also make it possible, because without my neurons, I wouldn't be able to make decisions. I wouldn't be able to do things, right? So the way to look at how the ancient Stoics thought about the relationship between themselves and the universe is pretty much like the relationship between my neurons and myself. we are part of this cosmic living organism. Now, modern Stoics don't believe, most modern Stoics, there are exceptions, don't believe that the universe is a living organism because we just follow whatever the physicists tell us, and the physicists don't think of the universe as a living organism. Mm-hmm. So, in that sense, a modern Stoic is more likely to believe in what is sometimes referred to as Einstein's God. Einstein was famously asked at one point if he believed in God, and his answer was, "Sure, I believe in the laws of nature."
Mm-hmm. And
meaning, right? Meaning that, I believe that the universe is organized in a logical manner, because if it were not organized in a logical manner, in a rational manner, then we wouldn't understand it. There would be no science possible. But where that rational organization comes from, we don't know. Physicists haven't given an answer yet. So it's just a fact of life. It's a raw fact. The universe is organized according to laws and principles, and we act following those laws and principles.
So do you think that this accordance to living in connection to nature? I mean, what position does that put us in? Do you think it puts us in a place to grow as people more if we're connected to nature?
I think so, but we need to be clear about what that phrase actually means in the Stoic context. So one thing that it doesn't mean is that we should go running naked into the forest and hang in trees. That's not what living according to nature means, although, of course, there's nothing wrong with that if you want to do it. But the phrase itself just means that we should be taking seriously both the nature of the universe and the nature of humanity, of human beings. Okay? Still there?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay, good, because now I'm getting paranoid.
Okay. No, I got a little silent because I thought you were going to keep going.
Yeah, all right.
So,
okay, I'm going to keep going. So,
okay.
So what that means is two things: the nature of the universe and the nature of humanity. The nature of the universe means that we better live our lives following, understanding exactly how the laws of physics work. If you try to do something that goes against the laws of physics, you're going to get yourself into trouble. Now, you might say, well, who's going to be so silly to do something against the laws of physics? And my answer would be plenty of people. For instance, anybody who uses homeopathic medicine is doing something against the laws of physics. Is thinking that diluted sugar, essentially, and water will cure diseases. That's nonsense. And a Stoic would say, no, don't do it, because that means you don't understand the nature of the universe. Or, I don't know if you remember, several years ago, there was this very, unfortunately, highly successful book and DVD that came out. It was called The Secret. Right. Yeah. So The Secret is based on an incorrect understanding of the universe, essentially. Right. So The Secret says that if you really want something, if you really truly want something like, a new job or a new relationship or whatever it is, then the universe will somehow sort of bend and recognize that no, it doesn't work like that. In fact, Epictetus, 2,000 years ago, almost 2,000 years ago, explicitly wrote that it doesn't work that way. One of his students was complaining because he had a broken leg. And Epictetus says, well, what do you want? That the universe just changes things around so that your leg is not broken? Yeah, deal with it. You got a broken leg. Well, worse things can happen. So one level of the phrase living according to nature means just live your life according to your best understanding of how the world actually works, and not according to how you would want the world to work. So it's essentially it's a way of saying don't engage in wishful thinking. But the second part, I think, is even more important, the one about human nature. So the Stoics thought that there are two fundamental aspects to human nature. One is that we are eminently social organisms. We can, if we need to, we can survive in isolation, but we only thrive in social groups. So we're eminently social. And the second component is that we are also capable of reason. We're the only animal, or at least the animal in which reason has really achieved sort of levels that are not found anywhere else in nature.
Right.
From these two things, they concluded that, therefore, a good life for a human being is a life in which you apply reason to improve social living.
Oh, okay.
So the meaning of life, according to Stoics, is precisely that. And Marcus Aurelius says it explicitly in the Meditation. He says, do whatever social reason demands, and only whatever social reason demands, because that's the whole point. The point of living a human life is to be helpful to others, make things better for everybody, which means, of course, making things better for yourself.
So Massimo, let's just take a little bit of a pause. You're feeding us so much information, which I love so much. But I just want to backtrack a little bit, and I want to cover. You mentioned Marcus Aurelius. I find his life fascinating. I think it's so interesting, the story behind everything he was doing, the position that he was in. But I'll let you tell the story. Can you tell us more about Marcus Aurelius, his life as an emperor, and what he was doing when he wrote Meditations?
Well, I started at the end then, because he wrote the Meditations near the end of his life. We don't know exactly which years, but close to the end of his life. And in fact, he was on the frontier, fighting an 8-year-long war against the Marcomanni and other German tribes. These tribes had essentially tried to invade Roman territory. There had been some negotiation. The interesting bit actually about this is that not only this was a defensive war that Marcus was doing, but in fact, it was a war that resulted out of the fact that the Marcomanni actually wanted to be part of the Roman sort of ecosystem. They wanted to be able to trade as equal partners with the Romans. And so there was some disagreement essentially on economics, if you will. And as often is the case, when disagreements of economics cannot be resolved diplomatically, then people start taking up arms. So Marcus found himself, he did not want to wage war, but he found himself on the frontier near the end of his life. And this is where he wrote the Meditations. We know this for a number of reasons. For one thing, because of his correspondence with some of his friends and associates, but also because 2 volumes of the Meditations actually explicitly say that they were written in the field, and they even give the location. So we know where he was. Now, Marcus had arrived there. He was in a very interesting way. So first of all, he was one of the so-called 5 good emperors. There was a period, this was the peak of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was its most peaceful as well as its most extensive during the reigns of these 5 emperors, which included Adrian and Antoninus Pius. Antoninus Pius was Marcus' adoptive father.
Okay.
So Adrian, in fact, had suggested to Antoninus Pius that he should adopt Marcus, because Adrian saw in Marcus, the young Marcus, somebody who had the chops. He had what it took to become an emperor. So Marcus was basically raised in Antoninus Pius' household and palace. He was given instructions, education accordingly. And he studied philosophy since he was very young. He studied with a number of philosophers, not just Stoics. He was sort of looking at different philosophical approaches. He also studied rhetoric. He studied a number of things. But apparently, since he was very young, Stoicism is the thing that clicked with him. Okay. His Stoic teachers were the ones that made the most impression, and he sort of tried to start practicing Stoicism to the point that his mother got worried, for instance, because as a boy, he started sleeping on the floor in order to instead of in a bed.
Poverty.
Yeah, right. So to remind himself that he could cope with adversity, and his mother said, "None of this nonsense. You need to go to bed." That sort of stuff. Now, eventually, after Antoninus Pius died, Marcus became emperor. In fact, he became co-emperor. He decided to share the empire with Marcus Verus, who was not exactly the best co-emperor, but he did his job. He did okay. And then at some point, Verus died, and Marcus became the sole emperor in charge of everything. This was a pretty difficult time. As I said, the 5 emperors did oversee a time of peace and prosperity for the Roman Empire. But when it came to Marcus, he was pretty unlucky. Mm-hmm. He had to face one war on the eastern frontier against the Parthians, who were one of Rome's regular standby enemies. The second war later on, as I mentioned, on the German frontier, he also faced an internal rebellion. One of his trusted lieutenants at some point declared himself emperor, so they had to be dealt with. And most importantly, he had to deal with a plague that was brought back to Rome by the legions coming back from the east. And plague was the worst recorded in ancient history. It probably killed between 3 and 5 million people. That's a lot to deal with during someone's reign. And so what you see in the Meditations is essentially Marcus coming to terms with all this stuff. How do I deal with things? How do I cope with the stress and the fact that some of my own people are sort of betraying me? Apparently his wife was not faithful either, so that was another problem.
Oh, no.
And the Meditations is essentially a personal diary where Marcus is made up of 12 books, so-called, but in fact it's one book with 12 chapters, really. And in each book, you see Marcus going over and over on the same themes. In fact, one of the criticisms that people have of the Meditations is that it is repetitive and then it's preachy. But that's to be understood. It's, of course it was repetitive. It's somebody's diary, personal diary.
Sure.
So presumably you run into the same problems over and over, so you write about the same problems over and over. And as far as the preachiness is concerned, well, he was preaching to himself. He was telling himself.
And he never meant to be published. Like this was not it was not his intention to publish this journal that he was writing for himself. And
right.
I mean, he had anything at his disposal that he wanted. He was emperor, so
yes,
he had all the money that he wanted. I mean, people were bothering him for something every day. So, I mean, what was something that Marcus said that sort of hit home with you? Like, I think in a paraphrase, I think he said something like, people will ask you for money today. They will annoy you. They will bother you. Yeah. And so I thought it was really amazing that this posthumous, this person has become, such a almost a literary genius. Like, he's putting out this philosophy without the intention of doing that, which gives it this whole other color and dimension that I find fascinating about his life.
Yeah, that's exactly right. In fact, the bit you're thinking of is one of my favorite quotes from the Meditations, where he says, remember, you should start out every morning expecting that people are going to be nasty and treacherous and vile and so on and so forth. This was his normal sort of experience of the world. It says, don't expect otherwise. I mean, to expect otherwise is like, expecting a fig to be in flower in the winter, to use actually a metaphor that comes out of Epictetus. It's like, that would be silly. It would be irrational. This is one of those things, again, that goes back to the dichotomy of control with which we started this conversation, right? So you don't expect that people all of a sudden change and become great and good and everything. You just deal with what they actually are, not with the way in which you want them to be. But then he goes on in the very same paragraph. He says, but remember, you have also made mistakes. You've also been annoyed, and you've also been, creating problems from others. And not only that, everybody does that, does what they do because they think that they're right. I mean, you rarely encounter somebody who's decided, bent on doing the wrong thing, knowing that it's the wrong thing. People are in good faith usually. They think that they're doing what the right thing is. They may be mistaken, and they may be annoying as a result, or creating problems as a result. But you need to sort of understand where they're coming from. And then finally, he says, still in the same paragraph, in the same section, he says, regardless of all of this should not touch you, because what you can do is always to retreat in yourself and think about what is the right thing to do and do it. Regardless of what other people think or regardless of what other people do, it is up to you to do the right thing. Again, this is another application of the dichotomy of control. Mm-hmm. He's saying, look, you don't control what other people do, but you do control how you react to that. You do control what you do. You do control your own judgments, your own decisions to act or not to act. So focus on those, and you'll be fine. So it's a very wise way of sort of approaching problems. Meditations also starts out, the entire first chapter in meditation, it's called the first book, as I said, but it's a chapter. The first chapter on the Meditations really is a long exercise in gratitude. He starts out by saying, I'm thankful to my father for this, my mother for that, my grandfather for this, my friends for this, my teachers, and so on and so forth. It's a great example of, literally, as you were saying a minute ago, the most powerful man in the Western world at the time, that begins his own diary by reminding himself that he's got to that point of power and of prestige and everything because of countless people who have been good to him and who have influenced him for the better. And it's a great exercise in humility, essentially, in being grateful to people, which we all could use a little bit more of.
Yeah, for sure. And I love the idea of his life, and at the limits he was tested, I would say he was probably the greatest ruler that we've seen in recent times and in ancient history times. It doesn't seem like there's a ruler that I've heard of that is so balanced and thinking so clearly about how to rule, how to govern, how to deal with everyday sort of problems and issues, and really addressing that you're going to deal with shit. It's going to come up, whether it's from other people or whether, maybe the livestock, there's a plague and the livestock all dies, or, something happens, but it's going to test you. It's going to test that inner resolve that you have. And I think if we circle back and we add this into our lives today, we have technology, we're connected all the time to our devices, we're online. So it presents a new way of sort of giving problems, because I can read, I can go to Massimo's Facebook page and pull up, I'm like, Massimo, you were having dinner. We were supposed to go to dinner. What happened? You know what I mean? So
that's right.
So it's really interesting to connect such an ancient philosophy to modern day living.
Oh, so absolutely. So one thing that I think social media does for me, I have to use social media for a number of reasons. Some of them are sort of personal because most of my family, for instance, is in Italy and I live in New York. So it's a nice way to connect and stay in touch with my brothers, my sister, my nephew, my niece, etc. And some of it is professional, right? I use Twitter and Facebook as to broadcast my professional writings, to learn about other people's writings, and so on. So I have to be essentially, I have a choice. I could decide not to do it, but it's a very good thing for me to do. That said, almost every day when I get on Twitter or Facebook, it's an exercise in stoic resilience, because of course somebody's going to troll me, somebody's going to be nasty, somebody's going to be doing this or that or the other, and you wonder, it's like, what are these people thinking? Why are these people doing this? But if you take it as a challenge, remember I mentioned the notion, Bill Irvine's notion of the gods, the stoic gods are throwing you a challenge. If you think of it in terms of a challenge, then you say, okay, well, let me see how can I cope better with people who are in fact annoying or insulting or something like that. And it really helps. I mean, my behavior
tell me more.
It's amazing. My behavior online has improved dramatically for the last several years, because every time I go in, I'm mentally prepared. So, okay, here goes another stoic challenge. Let's see how you can do it. And when you do a challenge to yourself, you automatically pay attention. You automatically try to sort of do better. And you say, aha, this guy, I know what this guy is trying to do. He's trying to get a nasty response out of me. I'm just not going to do that. Stoics were really big on insults, as in not doing insults, but on handling insults. So Epictetus, for instance, says that there's two ways to deal with an insult. The basic one, which is easily accessible to everyone, is to react to an insult as a rock would. So I actually have some of my students do this as an exercise. I said, go out in the backyard, pick up a rock, and then start insulting it. Mm-hmm. How does that feel? And of course they do it, and of course they say, well, if I feel like an idiot. I say, exactly, that's the point. If somebody insults you and you don't respond, they're going to feel like idiots. Because the point of an insult is to get a reaction out of it. Right. If you don't get the reaction, if the person who insults you doesn't get a reaction, he's like, well, what's going on here? What am I missing?
Precisely.
Right? Yeah. And so that's an easy thing to do. It's like, well, somewhat easy. It actually requires some training, but it's relatively easy to do. It's just don't react. Just walk away. The more sophisticated reaction to an insult is also brought up by Epictetus, and Epictetus says, so there's a bit in the discourses where one of his students says, "Hey, I heard this guy. He has all sorts of bad things to say about you. he said this and that, and he insulted you. And Epictetus' response is, oh, well, that's because he doesn't know me well. Otherwise, he could have said much worse. Mm-hmm. So in other words, you use humor to diffuse a situation. I mentioned Bill Irvine, my colleague and friend, earlier, and he has this example where years ago he's a philosopher, he's a professional philosopher. So years ago he was walking in the halls of his apartment, and a colleague stops him and says, "Oh, Bill, I was just thinking, I'm finishing writing my book, and I was just thinking of mentioning your work." Mm-hmm. And Bill's natural immediate reaction was to think, "Oh, well, that's nice. There's a colleague who recognizes my work." But before he could say anything, the colleague goes on and says, "Yeah, the problem is that I haven't decided yet whether what you wrote is misguided, is wrong, or downright evil." So Bill thought for a second, remembered Epictetus, and he answered, "Well, why not both?" And then walked away. And the colleague was stunned because, what are you going to say at that point? So somebody's basically not only deflected the insult, but in fact, sort of like a boomerang, throw it back at you. It's like, "Oh, you could have run worse, and I don't care. That's your opinion. That's under your control. Under my control is to simply ignore you because you're beneath my notice. I just don't care. Sure. I don't give a damn about it." So this is something that people can, in fact, practice on a regular basis because there are all sorts of opportunities to do so, on the job, sometimes with friends, sometimes with relatives. I mean, imagine, your typical Thanksgiving dinner where your insane uncle is going on racist rants or something like that. There are countless opportunities, and of course, including the ones online, to feel insulted and to react to the insult. In fact, we kind of live in a society at this point where outrage and insults are just flying all over the place. But try a little stoic approach and next time around, either completely ignore the insult or deflect it by way of humor and see how it feels. I really, since I started doing that, I feel so much better myself. And I know that I pissed off a lot of people.
No, I know for sure that, when you're in that state of where you expect someone respond to, and you're like almost goading them, you're poking them, you're pushing them, right. And you're looking for that feedback. And when someone expects you to be enraged and you give them no response at all, it enrages them further, which is beautiful. It's almost like deflecting an attack. There's a quote from Epictetus that I really, really like. It says, "Who then is invincible? The one who cannot be upset by anything outside their reasoned choice."
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. Because your reactions to you, so you are in complete control. If you train yourself well, you are in complete control of your reactions. Now, let me make a point here. It's an important caveat, because sometimes people misunderstand what we're talking about and say, "Oh, but what do you mean?" I mean, I feel I cannot avoid getting upset if somebody, insults me, or I cannot avoid being angry or something. Well, let's talk about what exactly you can and you cannot avoid. The immediate reaction is unavoidable. This is what the Stoics call a proto-emotion. So, the little anger that you feel is welling inside you when somebody starts saying something that you think is insulting or stupid or something, that's not avoidable. That's just a natural reaction. Or that little, instantaneous fear that you feel if you hear a loud noise all of a sudden that you're not expecting. That kind of, immediate sort of automatic reaction. Those things you do not control. You cannot control, and the Stoics never said that you should try to control them. They're just natural reactions. Mm-hmm. However, both the Stoics and modern cognitive scientists thought that the mature emotion, what they actually called a passion, but the mature emotion is a combination of the proto-emotion and of your cognition, of the fact that you're thinking about things in a certain way. So you cannot avoid the proto-emotion, but you can definitely work on the fully fledged emotion, because that one includes a cognitive part. That includes a judgment. So, for instance, if you say, well, I cannot avoid feeling, a little disturbed by somebody who's insulting me. That's true. You cannot avoid it. Mm-hmm. But then you can stop yourself and say, okay, this guy just doesn't know what he's talking about. He's just opening his mouth and air comes out of it and I'm not hearing it. That's up to you to modify your judgment. Instead of going, oh yeah, I have plenty of reasons to get upset. In fact, I'm going to be really upset that I'm going to be punching on the nose or something. Instead of doing that, so in other words, feed on your proto-emotion until it develops a full-fledged anger, you can actually do exactly the opposite and say, what am I upset about? The guy's just talking. So what?
Right.
That doesn't make any difference in my life. That's not going to affect me.
Right.
Similar with the loud bang, the noise. Well, if it turns out that the noise is in fact somebody shooting a revolver, then you might want to take cover. But more likely than not, it isn't. It's just something outside happened, and or something inside your apartment fell down. It's like, okay, well, that's not a big deal. No reason to get upset, so you calm down immediately. So a lot of the way in which we react to things is under our control, not in the sense that we can avoid the proto-emotion, but in the sense that we can actually reason through the thing. In a sense, it's kind of the opposite of the famous commercial, right? Instead of just do it, the Stoics would say, stop. Yeah, stop and think about it. It may very well be that then you want to do it. I mean, it's not, the notion isn't that you always end up thinking that there is no action to be taken. Sometimes there is an action to be taken. For instance, if, let's say, a co-worker is being harassed by your boss, well, there is an action to be taken there because one of the fundamental Stoic virtues is the virtue of justice. And you should intervene. If you see an injustice being done, you should intervene and try to, counter it as much as possible. So sometimes your judgment is that, yeah, you should act. But a lot of the times, your judgment is going to be, if you think about it, it's like, no, I don't think so. It's just not worth my energy. It's not worth getting upset about it.
For sure. So Massimo, I'm gonna have to reel you back in, man. You're your own person. You just developed a topic all by yourself. It's great. I mean, I love hearing you talk. Don't get me wrong, but you're like your own segue artist. So okay, I want to talk about virtues. Because the Stoics were very strong about living an honorable life, and the different virtues that we should embody in our actions and what we do and who we are. So what are some of the cardinal virtues, please?
Right. So the Stoics first of all, Stoicism is a type of virtue ethics. There are several different kinds of virtue ethics. The most famous one is Aristotle's. Then there is Epicureanism. There's a number of them. Stoicism is one type, one version of virtue ethics. And what they all have in common is, as you were saying, that we are supposed to act following certain virtues. Virtues are essentially propensities to act in one way or another. They're part of our character. They're part of who we are. The Stoics in particular recognize four cardinal virtues, four fundamental virtues. And these are practical wisdom, courage, justice, and temperance. Practical wisdom is the knowledge of what is good for you and what is not good for you. And for the Stoics, really, that boiled down to a very simple thing. We're going back again to the dichotomy of control. Mm-hmm. Whatever is good for you is what is under your control. Whatever is, and you do right. And whatever is bad for you is what is under your control. You don't do right. So in other words, your good judgments are good for you. Your bad judgments are bad for you. And nothing else. Everything else is not under your control. So you should simply ignore it. Mm-hmm. So that's practical wisdom, which means in practice, so to speak, that everything you do, you should ask yourself the basic question: is this under my control or is it not? So that's practical wisdom. Courage is not just physical courage, but the courage to stand up and do the right thing. So mm-hmm. It's really moral courage. Well, what's the right thing? Well, the right thing is what concerns the third virtue, the virtue of justice. Justice tells you that you should be treating other people fairly. You should be treating other people as you wanted to be treated, and you should never treat other people as means to an end, but as ends in themselves. In other words, you should recognize them as human beings that are inherently worthy of respect. They're not your tools. They're not something to play with. They are human beings just like you. And then finally, temperance essentially means that you need to react to situations in the proper measure, neither too much nor too little. So let me go back to my example of the boss that is harassing a coworker, right? Mm-hmm. What is practical wisdom telling me? Well, that I can arrive at a judgment that that what boss is doing is in fact incorrect, and I can do something about it. I may not be able to change the boss's mind. I may not be able to stop the behavior, but I can certainly try to intervene. That is under my control, so I should intervene.
Right.
Courage tells me that I should summon the courage to intervene. It's not just a theoretical thing. I actually need to do it in practice, and that may take courage because, after all, he's my boss, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I could suffer consequences from intervening. So I need courage. Justice tells me that, in fact, harassing a worker is not a good thing. It's unjust because it is not treating the person with respect. And temperance tells me that I need to do it to react properly. I don't want to just whisper something under my breath because my boss is not going to hear it. That would be underreacting. But I also don't want to go and punch him on the nose,
Sure,
because that would be overreacting.
Sure.
Right? So I need to act with temperance. I need to just stand firm and say clearly and with calm, is like, this kind of behavior is really not acceptable. So those are the fundamental virtues. And the way the Stoics use them is as moral compass. So imagine that when you navigate around city, you need a map. You have a compass. When you navigate a ship, or an airplane, you need a compass to know where you're going.
Mm-hmm.
And interestingly, of course, compasses do have 4 cardinal points, right? North, south, east, and west.
Yeah.
And the same goes for the 4 cardinal virtues. Essentially, the notion is that every time you are in a difficult situation, or a situation where you have to make a decision, you should ask yourself, well, is this under my control or not? Is this a courageous thing to do? Is this a just thing to do? And am I reacting temperately?
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, if we brought this into, instead of putting on the Kardashians or some mainstream garbage, if we talked more about virtue, wisdom, justice, courage, and temperance, I mean, I think maybe we would make leaps and bounds. And I mean, it's to be said that such an ancient, do you think, this leads me to my next question, do you think that there was, I mean, for the research for the show, I was looking at the links between Buddhism and Stoicism, and there seems to be an interesting parallel between those things. Like, I think Buddhism originated about 2,500 years ago, whereas Stoicism was about 2,300 years ago. So Buddhism is a little bit older, and Buddhism adds in a sort of spiritual, like, enlightenment, the path, the way, they talk about suffering as well. So, I mean, it seems like there are many links into these two systems of thought.
There are, absolutely. We don't think, at least, that those links are the result of direct influence, although there was a important ancient Greek philosopher, Pyrrho, who was a skeptic, in the original sense of the term, and therefore not a Stoic, who did go to India with Alexander the Great, and we know that he came in contact with Buddhist monks, and Buddhism was right at the beginning at the time. So, and interestingly, we don't actually have written down books from Buddhism of that time. So it's at least possible, people have speculated, that there are some reciprocal influences, that Pyrrho brought back to Greece some influences from Buddhism, and that vice versa, he influenced very, very early Buddhism. Unfortunately, we don't know. The only thing we know is that he went there and he did have contacts. We don't really have much of a sense of how much of an influence was either way. But you're absolutely right that there are strong similarities between Buddhism and Stoicism. In fact, I typically think of, I present Stoicism as the Western Buddhism. Those are not the only two that are similar. I mentioned earlier similarities with certain aspects of Christianity, the Serenity Prayer, or even medieval Judaism. There are also strong similarities between both Buddhism and Stoicism and other Eastern philosophies, such as Taoism, for instance. But the ones between Buddhism and Stoicism are particularly strong. Mm-hmm. The two philosophies differ dramatically in terms of metaphysics. So let me step back for a second to give a little bit of background.
Sure.
I think that every philosophy of life, such as Buddhism, Stoicism, Epicureanism, etc., but also every religion, Christianity, Judaism, Confucianism, whatever you want, all of those have two components, at least two components: a metaphysics, which means an account of how the world works, and an ethics, which is an account of how you should work within the world, how you should act within the world. So if you think about every religion, take Christianity, for instance, Christianity does have a metaphysics. It has an account of how the world actually works. It was created by God, and so on and so forth. There's a providence, etc. And then there is, of course, the ethics. What are you supposed to do if you're a good Christian in order to be a good Christian? The same exact thing goes for every other philosophy or religion of life that I know of, including, therefore, Buddhism. Now, the difference between Buddhism and the big differences between Buddhism and Stoicism are in the metaphysics. Okay. The two metaphysics are very different. The Stoics, as we were saying earlier, were clearly materialists. They thought that the universe itself, God, the soul, everything is made of matter.
Okay.
Everything is made of stuff.
Okay.
While on the other hand, Buddhist metaphysics is more esoteric. It's more, they do believe in reincarnation, for instance, or in things like karma, stuff like that. There's nothing like that in Stoicism. But despite those very different metaphysics, their ethics are very, very similar. You can have, the Buddhists, of course, have the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path to Wisdom, and so on and so forth. They have concepts such as non-attachment, and etc., proper action, proper intention, and so on and so forth. Well, the Stoics is something very similar. They have the virtues, they have the economy of control. They work out. They use different names, but they work out about the same approach in practice. So there are very strong similarities. Now, you mentioned enlightenment, which is kind of an interesting concept because, of course, in the Buddhist tradition, enlightenment is has a metaphysical sort of component to it. Certain things happen when you become enlightened. But the Stoics do have an equivalent of the enlightenment, and that's called ataraxia. Ataraxia means serenity or tranquility. Mm-hmm. And basically the notion is that if you actually act like a Stoic in life, you will achieve ataraxia. You will be serene. And you will be serene because you will always do whatever it is under your control, and you will always accept with serenity everything else that you cannot control. You'll say, well, sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. Today I lost. Well, that's too bad, but there's going to be a next time. Okay. And that kind of attitude toward things that happen to you brings serenity and brings a state of mind that the Stoics refer to as ataraxia. Now, the difference between ataraxia and enlightenment is that in Buddhism, enlightenment is in a very strong sense, at least from what I understand it, it's a goal. It's one of the things you want to do. You want to achieve enlightenment. For the Stoics, ataraxia is a side product. It's a nice side product, but it's a side product nonetheless. The goal for a Stoic is not to achieve ataraxia, it's not to achieve serenity. The goal is to behave morally, is to be a good human being, essentially. In fact, interestingly, the word virtue that we've been using before, unfortunately in English it sounds a little weird, largely because it has sort of very strong Christian connotations. But virtue in the original Greek is arete, and arete just means excellence. So what the Stoics are trying to say is that we should try to be excellent human beings, the best human beings you can. Mm-hmm. Well, what does that mean? I mentioned earlier, living according to nature. Well, the best human beings are the human beings that live to the fullest potential of what a human being can do. And that, according to the Stoics, is to live socially and reasonably. So the more reasonable you are, the more sociable you are, meaning you're helping society, not that you have then the more excellent of a human being you are. So the goal in Stoicism is to become an excellent human, the best human being you can. Mm. As a consequence, if you get there, if you become what the Stoics call the sage, which would be the equivalent of a Buddhist, enlightenment,
sure,
then you also achieve ataraxia, also achieve complete serenity of mind.
Yeah, what an amazing concept! This idea of, tranquility within oneself while living. I think that's the key here. Were the Stoics meditators? Did they meditate?
Well, so the word meditation has, of course, different connotations in different traditions. Sure. And in fact, even within, it has many different connotations, some of which are actually similar to the Stoic one and some of which are very different. So most Westerners who have heard of Buddhism, they tend to think about Zen meditation and things like that. And so those are exercises you do in order to empty your minds of thought, focus on a mantra, let your thoughts go, essentially. That kind of meditation is not found in Stoicism. But there are Buddhist meditations in other Buddhist traditions that are much more similar to what the Stoics think of as a meditation. I mean, after all, the common title of Marcus Aurelius' book is The Meditations.
Right, exactly, yeah.
But meditation here, in the Stoic sense, means reflection. So you want to reflect on certain things. You write your diary, your philosophical diary, so that you can learn from your experiences. Seneca actually gives specific instructions on how to do this, and Epictetus does as well. Seneca says you should wait until the evening before you go to bed. Don't do it in your bed because you're going to fall asleep. But before you go to bed, find a moment of quiet and a place of quiet in your house or in your apartment, and then write down the answer to the following questions. Ask yourself today: what did you do wrong? What did you do right? And what could you do better? And the point is, you want to know what you did wrong, not because you want to indulge in regret and flagellate yourself or something like that. That's pointless, because the past is outside of your control. Mm-hmm. But you do want to learn from your mistakes. So writing down things like, well, today I did this and I shouldn't have done it. That is a way to fix that memory in your psyche, a way to pay attention to the fact that you did do something.
I love
the
that.
second thing is, right, so what did they do right? Because Stoicism is also a very self-forgiving and other-forgiving kind of philosophy. Great, there are things you did right, I'm sure. So pat yourself on the back, because it's good. You need to pay attention to the things you did right just as much as to the things you did wrong. Because after all, in the long run, the whole point is to move away as much as possible from the bad things and move away toward as much as possible the good things. So basically what you can think of your practice as a way to alter the balance, diminish as much as possible the bad things or your mistakes, and increase as much as possible the good things. And then the third question is, what could I do better? Well, the reason for asking yourself that question is because often we encounter the same or very similar situations, right? You go to work every day, you see the same people, you run into similar situations, or you go and you have your family and you come back in the evening and, you're going to end up in very similar situations with your friends and so on and so forth. And so maybe today you did not react well on your job or with your friend or with your partner. But, the same thing or something very similar is going to happen again tomorrow or next week. And so if you pay attention and you ask yourself, what could I do better? How is it going to be better the next time around? How am I going to react better the next time around? Again, that's because you write it down, that's forcing you to pay attention. It's essentially, in a sense, making a plan for the future and say, okay, well, the next time that something like this happens, here's what I'm going to do. And you do that, if not every day. Seneca says actually every day. I don't do it every day. I do it several times a week. Whenever the need arises, I mean, you may have entire days where you don't actually do anything particularly noteworthy, either
it's
bad
necessary,
or good.
Right? I mean, it's totally necessary to have these types of tools that we can use cognitively where, whether it's writing down, these things that you feel you've done wrong every day at the end of every day before you go to bed. It for me, I've practiced this a little bit, inconsistent, but, it leaves me with a sense of being clean at the end of the day.
Yeah,
and
that's right.
and it's almost like a unloading sort of phase. I mean, the Stoics had these sort of cognitive behavioral therapies that they practiced. I mean,
Yes.
So it leads me in perfect segue into the premeditatio malorum. Am I saying that correctly?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, premeditatio malorum. Yes.
Okay, and what
thinking about bad shit happening?
Thinking about bad shit happening. Okay.
So it's interesting you mentioned the CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, which is one of the most successful evidence-based kinds of therapies that you can do today, psychotherapy. And interestingly, CBT started out in a couple of different forms, one of which was called rational emotive behavioral therapy, and still yes, actually. And early on in the 1950s and 60s, the people that got CBT started actually did it expressly by inspiring themselves to the Stoics, and particularly to Epictetus and Marcus Aurelius. So there are a lot of similarities between CBT and Stoicism. Of course, Stoicism is a philosophy of life, so it's not just a therapy. You're not supposed to use it only when you have a problem. While on the other hand, CBT tends to be more specific, more targeted. If you have a phobia or if you have an issue like depression or something like that, then you can go to a CBT practitioner to deal with it. You can think, however, of Stoicism as like sort of a CBT for life in general. People have normal kinds of day-to-day problems. Mm-hmm. So that's the relationship basically between the two. They work as I said, CBT is evidence-based, and therefore Stoic techniques work in a very similar way. Now let's go back to the premeditatio malorum just as an example. So premeditatio malorum, or the exposure to adversity, does find an analogy in CBT, and CBT practitioners call it an exposure to a negative stimulus or to a stimulus that you want to avoid. So let's say, for instance, that you have a phobia. One of my favorite is phobia of buttons. Some people, for whatever reason, have a phobia of they're scared of buttons.
Okay.
Which you would think, think
phobia of buttons.
That's right. Yes.
Okay. Some
people do have that. It's a clinical condition, and of course, there's no actual reason to be afraid of buttons. But some people have a phobia. So the way a CBT practitioner would go about it is, first of all, to let you imagine the button. Before you actually go near it or you touch it or handle it or anything, you imagine it, and you start imagining. What's the worst thing that can happen when I handle a button? Is it going to bite me? No. Is it going to poison me? No. Is it going to do something really bad to me? No. So you habituate yourself mentally. First, mentally. This is typically done in modern times. It's done as an actual visualization exercise. You close your mind, your eyes, and then you start thinking in your mind as if you were looking at a movie, watching a movie, or yourself doing that thing. And then eventually you graduate CBT. You actually graduate to actually getting exposed to the stimulus directly, to actually see the button, then handle the button, and so on, until eventually you be able to overcome your fear. Now, in the case of the premeditatio malorum, there are examples of this kind of technique that are found in Marcus Aurelius and in Seneca. And basically what they're doing is they are asking themselves the question, so what's the worst outcome possibly? What's the worst thing that can happen? So if I go, let's say, let's use a practical example. Let's say that tomorrow morning I have a job interview, right? Well, one way to do a premeditatio, there's different ways. One can do it in visualization exercise. Just said it. CBT practitioners do it, so you can just close your eyes and imagine yourself into the interview and so on. Another one is as a diary. You can write down, so the scenario. So what's going to happen? Or you can talk to somebody about the scenario. There's a number of different ways of doing it. But let's say I need to go tomorrow for this interview, and I'm concerned, worried about this thing. Well, the first thing you're going to ask yourself is, so what's the worst thing that can happen? I don't get a job. Fine. It's not the end of the world. I can survive. There will be other jobs. There will be other interviews. Or what's the worst thing that can happen? Well, I make a fool of myself in the interview. Well, worst things happen at sea, as Byron used to say. It's not the end of the world. We all embarrass ourselves. Sure. And, you're probably never going to meet that person again anyway. So you start by working yourself with the worst possible scenario, and then you work yourself back and say, yeah, but that's the worst thing. What's the next worst thing can happen? You're doing an interview, doing well, and you're not quite getting the job, but you're, in the finalists. Well, that's good. Well, what's the next thing that can happen? Well, the next thing can happen, actually, you do a really good interview and you're doing really well and you actually get the job and so on. So the notion is to be prepared for the worst on the grounds that A, the worst isn't going to be something you cannot bear. You will be able to deal with it, especially if you're prepared mentally for that. And two, the worst is actually unlikely to happen.
Right.
It's not a guarantee. It's not that you know that you're going to fail. It's possible, in fact. Sometimes it's likely things are going to be better than you think. So it's a way of reminding yourself that even the worst case scenario is not quite as bad as you might think, and also that you are capable of enduring it, that you're capable of withstanding it.
Exactly. If we put in front of us like the worst possible thing that can happen, and it's almost a form of understanding better, like rationalizing fears, like, so in some way, by seeing this written down on a piece of paper in front of you, you're realizing, okay, well, there are ways that I can deal with this if in the unlikely chance that it does happen. Most likely none of this stuff is going to occur. The interview has gone perfectly so far, minus our small technical issues, but it's been a great conversation, and I think we've covered some amazing topics that will really benefit people. So then shifting over, once you realize, okay, like I've listed down all of my fears in the worst case scenarios, then perhaps writing down, okay, what are the best things that can come out of this scenario as well?
Yeah, exactly. Now, there is one exception to all this, which is a big one as far as the Stoics are concerned. That's death. One thing you are not going to overcome is death, right? And so the Stoics, just like the Epicureans, actually write a lot about death. And in fact, Seneca goes so far as saying that death is the ultimate test of character. How you actually approach death is the ultimate test of character. Now, this is one where the worst case scenario, one of these days, is going to happen. We're all going to die. And therefore, the focus there shouldn't be on overcoming death. That's impossible. I mean, again, see above when we're discussing, living life according to nature and understanding how the universe works. Well, one thing that there is to understand about how the universe works is that we're all mortals. We're going to die. So then the question isn't really death itself. The question is how you can handle it. Are you prepared when it happens? Are your affairs in order? Are you mentally prepared? Are you emotionally prepared? Did you prepare your relatives, your loved ones? Did you talk to them, and so on and so forth? Those are the things that you can do. Those are the things under control, right? Mm-hmm. You can write your will. You can talk to your friends and family. You can prepare mentally. This is going to happen, and then when it's going to happen, it's going to happen. Now, after it happens, the Stoics agree completely with the Epicureans. That's it, done. There's nothing else to do because there's not going to be any you anymore. So being afraid of death, as in what happens after you die, it's like, there's nothing to be afraid of there because there isn't going to be any you anymore. Remember, the Stoics were materialists. They thought that death is the end of the story. You get reabsorbed in the universe. You become part of what they call the logos, the universal, this notion that we essentially recycled as part of the universe. But we are not going to exist as independent consciousness anymore. Mm-hmm. And therefore, there's nothing to be afraid of. As Epicurus, who is sometimes actually, despite the fact that he was a member of a rival school, he's often quoted by Seneca. As Epicurus said, wherever death is, you are not. And wherever you are, she is not. You're simply not going to be there. You're going to be there before it happens. Once it happens, that's it. There's not going to be any more you, so don't worry about it. In Seneca, in fact, in a very modern passage, at some point writes to his friend Lucilius that it's silly to be afraid of what happens after death. Those are the things that the poets have been scaring us with, or the priests have been scaring us with in order to control us. But there's nothing to be afraid of because there's nothing, period. There's going to be no sensations. Since there's going to be no body, there's going to be no sensation at all, and therefore there's nothing to be afraid of.
It won't matter to you. I mean, how would you know? If you don't have a body and you're not awake, you're not aware of anything, it's not going to matter to you at all. And if you do, then so be it. You decide what you want to do at that point. But if there's nothing there anyway, it's not. You're not going to have a space to react in.
That's right. That's exactly right.
So Massimo, we've been going for a little while. We've covered a lot of stuff. I mean, is there a way we can wrap this together with a nice little bow tie, make it pretty?
Okay. What do you have in mind?
Well, I mean, I really wanted to mention your book that you wrote, Handbook for New Stoics. It's actually on the screen for people to look at. We will provide the Amazon link. When does this book come out?
The book comes out on May 14th. And so it's just a couple of weeks away. Yeah.
I mean,
or less.
I went through the book, and it's actually really well written and really well
Thank you.
structured. You tell us a little bit about it. There are weekly exercises that you sort of perform each week with a different goal in mind.
Correct. It's a total of 52 exercises. Motivate can go on for an entire year doing this thing. Although my co-author Greg Lopez and I actually provide a shortcut in the beginning and say, if you don't want to go through the whole thing, here's the most important exercises, and then see how you feel about it and see if you want to proceed. But basically, the book is written as a workbook, as if it were in fact a CBT, a cognitive behavioral therapy workbook.
Mm-hmm.
You're supposed to interact with it. You don't just read it.
Right.
Actually, the publisher, The Experiment, did a very good job from a graphic perspective to highlight the different parts of the book and leaving space for people to write down their notes and checking boxes and things like that. But essentially, every exercise, every chapter is structured the same way. It starts out with a hypothetical day-to-day situation. So somebody who gets upset, for instance, because she's gone to the gym and somebody else has been misplacing stuff, and so now that gets in the way of her doing her routine, something like that. So it's a day-to-day situation, things that can happen to any one of us.
Mm-hmm.
Then immediately after that, we introduce a quote from one of the major Stoics, usually Epictetus, Seneca, or Marcus Aurelius, although there are some others that are quoted here and there.
Mm-hmm.
And the quote has direct pertinence. It's directly relevant to the situation that started out the chapter. After the quote, we explain the theory. We say, okay, so here's why this particular quote is relevant to this particular kind of situation. Here's how it's supposed to work.
Mm-hmm.
And then the rest of the chapter is an actual exercise where the reader is guided step by step throughout the week into actually practicing whatever it is that the exercise is about. So, for instance, if it is about not getting upset, you're going to say, well, okay, here are some techniques for not getting angry. Here are some techniques for overcoming the irritation. And then people can write down every day how they're doing, whether they're improving or not, whether the exercise is working or not for them, then set it aside onto the second exercise.
Okay, yeah. I mean, I really love it because it puts into a frame that, these concepts can be practical, and you really deliver that. You really deliver a method to sort of learn the different, because I feel sometimes the Stoics were a little abstract. It can be an abstraction to discuss emotions. Like, what is fear really? Like fear may mean something different for me than it does to you. We're clearly afraid of different things. So with this, you're putting people into situations with their own lives, and it is set up like a workbook. I'm just paging through the book right now, and it says on week 14 you evaluate your goals. And it's full of really practical stuff just like that. I mean, I'm not only just pitching it because you're my guest, I'm also pitching it because I really enjoyed it.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's unique. I mean, there's a number of books there on Stoicism. I wrote another one a few years ago called How to Be a Stoic. But most of the books about modern Stoicism that are out there are interesting. I mean, there's lots of good ones. They tend to be either theoretical or discursive. They talk about the history of Stoicism. There's some reference to practice for sure, but not in such a systematic way, holding your hand kind of way as the handbook for new Stoics, which I co-wrote with Greg Lopez. So we think that that's a unique entry into the canon, so to speak. So hopefully it will be useful to people to actually put this stuff into practice, because let's remember, Stoicism is a practical philosophy. It's supposed to change your life. If it doesn't change, in fact, Epictetus, again, himself, warns some of his students. He says, if you came here just to learn theory, you're wasting your time. If you don't get out of this classroom and actually practice, actually become a better person, actually, in fact, implement these things, then you're just wasting your time. Then it becomes just an exercise an academic exercise in the bad sense of the word. And Stoicism is supposed to really change your life, and it does. There's lots of people that started practicing a few years ago, and they told me that this approach really has turned things around for them. In some cases, helping them out of really bad situation. In other cases, just generally making their lives better. Focused, you pay more attention to what you're doing. You're less prone to anger, and therefore people like you more. You're better at dealing with people, and so on.
Wouldn't it be amazing? It's like the social media version of like road rage would decrease massively. Maybe all the haters we have would just chill out and relax and, have a drink and sit back and not take everything so personally. And,
right.
I think it genuinely can help. I mean, that's why we covered this, is because I really think Stoicism can offer people, even after so much time, now, today, in the modern world where we are overrun with information, connection, and things that generally produce anxiety. Mental illness is something that people deal with. I think 1 in 4 people in America suffer from some disability. So, I think the mental frame that we have on things, so crucial, so important. Massimo, thank you so much for your time and energy and just the material. I love the way that you wrapped it all together. I know there's a lot of material, and a lot of these people's lives, like Seneca, Epictetus, and Marcus Aurelius, like they lived very intriguing lives. And so to kind of bring it back around for us studying them, I think you did a great job.
Well, thank you very much. This was a lot of fun, and hopefully it's going to be useful to your listeners.
Yeah, I'm certain it will be. So just one more time, the book is called A Handbook for New Stoics, How to Thrive in a World Out of Your Control. It's a 52 week-by-week lessons guide written by my guest, Massimo Pigliucci. Am I saying your last name right?
The G is silent, so it's Pigliucci.
Pigliucci. Okay, I'm sorry. I should have asked that. We were in a mess of organization at the beginning. And Gregory Lopez is the co-author. And then when is the date this is going to be available? Awesome.
May 14th. It's available for pre-order now on Amazon and out on.
Great. We will make that link available in this video, and I'll send you a link as soon as we wrap this up. I'll send you a link where you can put it out to your feeds as well. Massimo, thank you so much for being on the show as our first live format guest. Is really truly an honor to speak to you, sir.
It was a pleasure. Thank you. Thank
you so much. Guys, you heard here, that was our guest. I mean, wow, what an amazing show to come back on. And there's so much more in store and ahead. We've got a whole litany of guests that are just absolutely going to blow your mind. They are going to blow your mind. That's how good it is. So be sure you stay in tune. I'm going to run the outro. I've been working nonstop for the last few weeks. I was in the jungle for a little while, and now I'm back in the States, and we're going full steam ahead with everything that's happening at HXP. So I hope you guys are ready for that. Here's the outro, guys. Thank you so much, and we will see you. You will hear from us next week.